Good morning to everybody. It is good to see you. Good to be here. Before we start, Kyle, could you lead us in a prayer?
Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this good day that we have to be here together. Thank you for sunshine, beautiful weather that we are having. Lord, we pray that as we see the fluctuations, the changes in the natural world around us, it reminds us always of your power, of your control. And Lord, we know that you are in control of things such as this. You know, you are the God that we can trust to be in control in our lives. Father, I pray that as we spend this time this morning studying about the various religions and views of others, about things higher than ourselves around this world, that we will strengthen us, Lord, strengthen us in our resolve to share your good news to the world around us, and help us to understand ways that we can enlighten others to see your majesty and your power. Please be with us today. Help us to have minds that are open to hearing and learning, find ways that we can help others around us. Please be with Jason. Let him have a good memory of the things we've prepared for this class. We love you. Father, we pray all this in your Son, Jesus' name.
Amen. Good deal. Thank you. So, we are looking at Judaism, and really, my goal, I'll just tell you up front what we're doing here. We're going to talk about Judaism as a whole this morning, and I'm going to try to pose a few questions to you and give you some time between now and Wednesday to look into some of these things and help us to think about how we could reach people who are of this faith and that sort of thing. So we'll get into that. There are a lot of different types of Jews. And in doing research for this, I've come to the conclusion that there are so many, and it's hard to understand. And we are not going to be experts in Judaism, modern Judaism. When we get done with this, there's just a lot there. But hopefully, we can look at some things that are common for at least most Jews and how they think and interpret things, and so we can get somewhere with them. So we're going to start and looking at lesson 2 today, talking about Judaism as a whole, and then spending time on Wednesday discussing how to approach people of that faith. So I don't know how much you've got to read into this and look at it. In general, I think a lot of us know somewhat about Judaism because that's kind of what our Old Testament is. And we have a lot of interactions, even in the New Testament, of Jesus and the Jew. I mean, Jesus was a Jew. And like all the apostles, they were Jews. And so we understand a little bit about that. But we're going to look at this and see where we get. The first paragraph here talks about there is a distinction between Jewish people and the religion of Judaism. And that's just saying that the Jewish people as a whole, there is a culture, like ethnical part of being a Jew, and there is a religious part of that as well. Back in the Old Testament, when they were given the law of Moses and they had all these requirements, that law was their religion, but it was also their culture, it was their heritage, and that's what they passed on, and it was just a way of life. So nowadays, you have people that are considered Jewish, but they can be atheist as well. So they're an atheist Jew, and that, to us, that might sound just completely weird, because it's like, how are you a Jew, but you're an atheist? Because it's a cultural identification. And this makes it even more complicated in trying to figure out how many Jews are alive in the world today. Because it's like, well, do you mean by heritage, or is it like following the religious beliefs, or do we include people who kind of identify as a Jew, or whatever? And so it's kind of hard to nail down. But there we go. Do you know where the term Jew comes from? Judah, yeah. And who was Judah? What was it? Okay, it was one of the tribes. So why do you think that we call them Jews or people who follow Judaism instead of like they're Benjis or Benjiism or Issachar or any of those? So why is it Judah and not any of the others? Do you know that? Okay, I think that's huge. But what happened to the kingdom at the very end of Israel's existence? Yeah, there it was. Like, we did have Israel as the nation, but then we had the Syrians who came in, took the top 10 tribes, and then we had Judah and Benjamin left, and then they sort of just like melded into this is Judah. And that's the one that survived, and that's where that name comes from. I mean, we call that land Judea, and that's where that comes from. So it's sort of the remnant of that. I think back in the days of the United Kingdom, and when everybody was there, you probably wouldn't call them all Jews. There were Israelites, even maybe Hebrews. But yeah, nowadays we do refer to them as Jews because tribe of Judah. Here we go. All right. There are actually a good amount of Jews in the U.S. Do you know what country? Well, let's trivia question. Do you know what country has the most Jews today? That's number 2, actually. Yeah, surprisingly. And this changed actually in the 1940s or so. The nation. What? Yeah, actually, no. Germany's, it's in the top 10. I should have written those down. But number 1 is Israel, actually. And it's kind of like, oh, well, okay. The Israel that's here now is not the same Israel that was before in the 1940s. I believe it was like a United Nations coalition that was like, let's get this promised land back in so we can be blessed. And there's a lot of things about that. But that's where a lot of Jews live now. Second place, though, is the U.S. And I tell you, I looked up, depending on which website you went to, you got a different number. But I'm getting the figure of about 15 million Jews in the world today, 6 to 7 million in Israel, 6 to 7 million in the U.S. Now, the U.S. by landmass is much bigger than Israel, so it's more spread out. But that being said, there's a good chance that you're going to encounter a Jew at some point. And I have teaching at school. I mean, there's some Jews in the community, and so you're gonna see that. But there we go. Symbols. Symbol Star of David is typical for Jewish heritage. Judaism, Star of David. But it says, as far as the religious aspects, the 2 better symbols to describe that is the menorah, 7-branch candlestick, and the 2 tablets of the law. Why do you... Okay, I think you know this, but tablets of the law, why is that a symbol of Judaism?
The covenant that God gave them on Sinai. It's where their religion started.
Yeah, exactly. It's Moses is looked at as being like the prophet, the most important prophet of Judaism. And so that's the law, the tablet. That's what really distinguished them from the other nations. I mean, they had that law, they had God's message, and so that was really important to them. And the menorah, we'll get into some of that a little bit later, but it's a lot of times we associate menorah with Hanukkah. And if you're not familiar with that story of where that came from, that's a big deal. We'll get to that when we talk about some of the traditions and feasts that they celebrate. But yeah, okay, we'll see that. Beginning of Judaism. Who do the Jews look at as being like the first? Now Moses is like the prophet, but who is the first? Hebrew. Well, who was it? Abraham, exactly. And so they trace their heritage to Abraham. And that's like the person who is important. Now, Abraham is actually important in 3 major world religions now. Judaism is one. Do you know the other two? Islam, yep, Muslims. And Christianity, yeah. We are spiritually Abraham's heritage, and there's a lot of passages. And that will be important later in the lesson, for sure. So Abraham does that. Now, the story of Abraham, where was Abraham when he got God's call? Ur of the Chaldees, and this land in Mesopotamia. Now, there's all kinds of information here about what that was. Ur was actually kind of an important city by the time that Abraham came. He was Abram at the time. But by the time he came along, he was there. I don't know if you looked into this. At the bottom of page 15, the right-hand side, Namu built the ziggurat. I don't know how to pronounce that. But it was essentially a temple. It was like a pyramid, kind of pyramid-shaped. And it was in order to worship the most important god of the land there in Ur. That was the moon god, Nana, or I don't. It looks like Nana to me. It's not written in here, but that's N-A-N-N-A. But the moon god. And that was common of that time period, that you had gods that were kind of regional. That was just like, we had a god of this place, a god of this place. But the thing that made Judaism so different is this, that we have one God. It's a monotheistic religion. One God who is in charge of everything. Creator of all, God of all. No matter where you go, he is there too. And that was much different. And so for Abram to get this call to pick up and to go, to leave that land, that showed a lot of faith on his part. That if he had the mindset of everybody around him, and he thought that, okay, this God is going to protect me while I'm here, who's going to protect me when I'm gone? Well, God was the one who did that. Now there's all kinds of things about the name of God, and the Jews really, I think it's the tetragrammaton, the YHWH. Now in Hebrew, that's going to be a little different, but that's how we look at that. And nowadays, we think that was probably like Yahweh or something. That's what we say. There's actually some evidence. It might be other things. Vowels weren't a thing in the Hebrew language, and so it's hard to know how it was really pronounced. And the people were scared to death of saying that name out loud, so it's kind of hard to know exactly what that was. But just know that there was an important, there was importance placed on that name. Side note, very recent discovery over in that land, Mount Ebal. There was discovered it was like the oldest Hebrew language tablets ever found. And this was it was discovered 2 years ago. They just released it about a month ago or so. And it is awesome. It has Yahweh, the name of God and of the people. And if the implications for that are amazing, look into it. We don't have time to discuss it in detail here. But that is awesome because it proves a lot of our faith. Okay, so Abraham. What was his family like? Who was his child? Well, children. He had children. Okay, yeah. And Ishmael, what do we know about him? Yeah, I like that. Wild donkey of a man. Against everybody, and that is where Islam came from, the Muslims. That nation came from. So Abraham had some big nations that came from him, people who are still around today. So we had them. But then we had Isaac, the child of promise, the one that God had, said, this is who your lineage is going to be through. And so we have Isaac. That's where the Jews came from. So we have Abraham, Isaac, and then Jacob. That's where things start to really spread out. Jacob had a brother. His name? Esau. And so that was their own, pretty big nation. It had the Edomites over there. But then through Jacob, you had the 12 tribes that come from that. And so that's where you get most of Israel. And then as you go through, Moses pops up. He was the prophet, and he's the one that gave them the law. And so pretty big deal. And he wrote the first 5 books of the Jewish scripture, the Torah. I almost said Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And there you go. That's the first 5 books of Moses, also called the Pentateuch. And very sacred writings. Very important to them. Now, along with that, if you look at your Old Testament in our Christian Bibles today, it's going to resemble what the Jews had, just maybe in a little different order. And so the way that it was listed, the first 5 books are the same. So we have Genesis through Deuteronomy, the Pentateuch. There we go. Second part of that was a group called the Prophets, and it rearranges our order a little bit of what we have, but it groups them together because of different reasons. And actually, this says it's divided into 2 parts. It's actually kind of divided into 3. So we have the former prophets, which Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. They didn't have 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. It was just like all one book. Then we have the latter prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. And so those 3. And then you have a book called the 12. And it was the 12 minor prophets, and they kind of included them all together in one book. But that was the prophets. So we had all those. Then the last category, the writings. Sometimes they were just referred to as the Psalms, just sort of like an overall arching name. But you had things like Psalms, Proverbs, Book of Job, and some other Ruth, Lamentations, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and the Chronicles. And so those were the writings, the last part. And that's where you get, I don't know if you've ever heard this referred to it, but the Old Testament scriptures, the Hebrew Bible, it was referred to as the Tanakh. And it's just like an acronym using the 3 parts. The Torah starts with a T, the Nevi'im, the prophets, and the Ketuvim. And I'm not going to slobber on you saying these. But Tanakh, that was the acronym. That was the scriptures. And if you see in Luke 24:44, Jesus refers to all of the Old Testament by those names. You had the law, the prophets, and the Psalms, which is just like this category, that one, and that one, all of it. And what he was saying there is like it was like all of those things look forward to Jesus. That's going to be important later as well. So tuck that in your pocket or something. Other important writings, you may not be as familiar with the Mishnah and the Talmud. Do you know what those are? What those things are? There you go. Yeah, it was things. It was really important to the Jews to have a rabbi's stamp of approval of what they were doing. And you can definitely see that in the time of Christ. You can see how they were really focused on what they had been taught and who was doing the teaching. There was a lot about that. And the traditions of the rabbis, like, for example, the law of the Sabbath. There was, in the old law, that statement of remember the Sabbath to keep it holy, and the instructions not to do work on the Sabbath. And that was God's instructions. If you look in, I think it's the Mishnah, it might be expanded in the Talmud, actually. But if you look on the section of how to do that, of what the Sabbath laws look like, it is an insane amount, like 100 pages or something of just like tiny text, and you can do this. You can carry this much, but not this much. Now, if you have your hands this way, it works, but if it's the other way, you can't. Or if you're, and there's just a lot of traditions that go along with it. But they were very much into what the rabbis were teaching. And you will find this today. A lot of people really put a lot of stock into what their rabbis teach and what is tradition and all of that. Not so different than a lot of people in a lot of religions, actually. And what's important to them is who is teaching and what they're saying about it. All right. Any questions or comments on any of that stuff up to this point? All right. So synagogues. This is an interesting thing. because you don't hear a whole lot about that in the Old Testament. And it's like, okay, where did that come from? How do you get a synagogue? It's a gathering of Jews. And this was mainly for Jews who were spread out in different places, not necessarily in Judah or Jerusalem or in any of those Jewish places. If you had at least 10 Jewish men, you can have a synagogue. And you would build that. And the way it was, I mean, you would have this, the Ark of the Covenant in the back. It wasn't like the actual Ark. It was just like a representation of that. By the way, Ark of the Covenant, that was lost at some point, and we don't even know. But it was the post-temple version of that. Some synagogues do separate genders, and so it just depends on where you go with that. But there are synagogues around, and you can find those for sure. Which brings me to this next part, divisions within Judaism. If someone tells you a Jew, you have to know a little bit more in order to know how to approach them. Because there are three major things: Orthodox Judaism, Reform Judaism, and Conservative Judaism. And really, there's all kinds of sub-beliefs and sub-things. And there's some ethnical things. You have like Hasidic Jews versus Ashkenazi Jews versus Sephardic Jews versus Mizrahi Jews versus a lot of other things I didn't write down and don't know how to pronounce. But in general, those three divisions, the Orthodox Jews, that wasn't a term that we really used until the Age of Enlightenment, the 18th century. This is the group of Jews who follow most closely to the law as possible. Like, when they read the law of Moses, it's like, we're going to follow every single commandment here, and that is what we're going to do. And so it's, and key point there, as interpreted by the rabbis. So that's a huge thing there. Reform Judaism there began in Germany in the 18th century in that time. And they were kind of separated from the Orthodox Jews, the ones that were really wholeheartedly serving the law of Moses. This is, they don't consider the Torah as binding today, and they're not waiting on a future messianic kingdom, which is interesting. The way that they think about the Messiah is different. And now, I guess we'll go ahead and say this now, but the concept of the Messiah, depending on what type of Jew that you're dealing with, might have a different concept of the Messiah. There are some who teach that the Messiah will be a person who comes to establish a physical kingdom on the earth in Jerusalem, and we just haven't seen him yet. And obviously we're like, Jesus? Well, yeah. Depending on your ideas there, you might have different thoughts about who Jesus was and what he did. We'll talk about that. But so there's that. You have some people who believe that the Messiah is really kind of a metaphor for like a utopian society, and what we're looking forward to is establishment of world peace and happiness on the earth, and we're going to get to that at some point. And some people just completely abandon the idea of the Messiah altogether. So there's that too. The reason I'm telling you all this is because don't just assume that every single Jew is going to believe the same things, and the way we approach them might be very different. And I was talking to Kyle before the class began. There's actually a group of Jews called the Messianic Jews who do believe that Jesus was the Messiah, and that he was the one, he was the prophet, he was God's chosen, and he came, and we should listen to him. That one's really confusing, because what do you do with what Jesus said then? But we'll talk about that too. And then you have the conservative Judaism. It's like they recognize the law is important, but it's let's modernize that. Let's look and see what our culture's doing, and paint our picture of what Judaism looks like based on that. So let's keep it modern and develop that. So there you go. Okay. Oh, some of the manners and customs. This is what I think is going to help us to be able to try to not intentionally offend someone. And if you know someone's a Jew, and if you see them doing some of these things, you can understand what's going on. And so instead of being like, that's stupid, what are you doing? Like, maybe we can understand a little bit about what's going on, so that way we can reach them a little better. So, very important to Jews, especially Orthodox Jewish worship, focuses on God and His law. They will pray 3 times a day, morning, noon, and evening. Which, by the way, I mean that's pretty good. That's maybe a lesson. Sometimes we don't pray as much as we should, so that's a really cool thing. But if a group of 10 or more can get together, they can form a synagogue, and that is the worship and study thing. The prayers require, depending on the branch of Judaism, requires wearing of phylacteries. You may have heard about that, talking about the Pharisees especially. But two little boxes, about 1 inch cubed, strapped to the forehead, and left hand containing little parchments of Scripture. So the whole part, that is something that's said, Put my law into your mind and bind them to your forehead and put them, I think we view that as more of a spiritual application, metaphor. But they literally do that. And they have a prayer shawl that wrap around. And their day of worship, I think you're familiar with that, is the Sabbath. And according to the Jewish time, it's Friday evening to Saturday evening. That is the Sabbath day. Their reckoning of time is a little different than what most cultures deal with. But there you go. That's what you do. Clothing, you probably know the first thing that's mentioned there is the yarmulke. And the yarmulke, that little hat thing, the reason for that is because it's supposed to be to them a sign of respect and reverence to God, that we're showing our submissiveness to the Lord. And depending on what branch, Orthodox Jews will typically wear those all the time. And that'll be constant because what they say is, well, God is everywhere. He's always present no matter where I am, so I always need to be wearing that as a sign of respect and reverence. And so that's where you go, which is interesting, and I do not want to get into discussion of this. Ask Michael about it, but 1 Corinthians 11, interesting talking about the head coverings, and I wonder if that had to do something with how the Jews viewed that. They also don't cut the sides of the hair. So, like, they have these big, I don't want to sound disrespectful, but like kind of bushy hairs around like the front of the ears. And the reason for that is Leviticus 19:27, you shall not round the head or something along those lines. And so that's why that's there. Dietary laws, you're familiar with those, I think. There are some things that are considered clean, some things are considered unclean. Give me an example of an unclean animal. Camel, yeah. That's not the first one I would guess that you would have said. But yeah, camel is definitely unclean. What? Shrimp, yeah. Crustaceans of any sort. What else? Swine, yeah. Pigs, that's the big one. And that's the one that's mentioned here because, like, that's what Jews are most known for, because that's like, most cultures will eat pig, and when a Jew refuses pig, that's like kind of stands out to people. It's like, what? Like, I understand not every culture serves rabbit. Rabbit is unclean as well. But pig is something that's kind of common. So, yeah, that definitely stands out. Things that are clean, you can, if you have a Jewish friend coming over, feel free to serve them ox, sheep, goat, deer, gazelle, antelope. Cows work as well, so you can do that. And as far as fish go, no catfish. They don't have scales. And things like shark, you probably won't be serving shark anytime soon, but those eels, any of that's unclean. Birds, chicken's okay. Yeah, it's not a bird of prey. Turkey is generally considered okay, and some of those things. Yeah.
Where do you source the clean food from? Because you mentioned deer. I've got plenty of that, but I have a feeling I couldn't serve that to a Jewish guest.
That's true, because the other part of this is is how it's prepared. And so typically the Jews are wanting like a certified Jew who is in charge of the cleaning the animal process and making sure that the blood is drained properly and that that you salt the meat a little bit to draw out any excess blood as well. So it's this whole thing. Yeah. Right. Exactly, because like there would be questions of, did you really get this from? Did you source it? And to them, like it's so important to their faith, and you get like you can kind of respect this, that they are so dedicated in making sure they're not taking anything unclean. I mean, you see the reaction of Peter when God Himself tells him to arise, kill, and eat, where he's like, like I've never done that. Why would I do that? I haven't defiled myself. And that's the same thing with a lot of Jews. And so you definitely be careful with that, because if a Jewish person refuses to come to your house to eat, maybe we understand why. And that's a thing. So those are important considerations. Another thing that stands out is if you are combining meat and dairy products, like that is a no-no. And a lot of it, the ideology behind that is there's a passage that says you shall not boil a young goat in her mother's milk or something like that. And they've taken it a lot further. And that is one interpretation, that means, no dairy and meat in the same meal. And so they have separate like cookware. It's like if I'm dealing with dairy products, use this cookware. If I'm dealing with meat products, this cookware. Cheeseburgers are off limits because that's both together. Yeah. Nice. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I could see that. And I mean, that makes sense, like as far as, because I mean, the law of Moses is very clear on like, we don't mix things together. We're very distinct. And so that would kind of be necessary if you're going to do that. So that's kind of crazy. There's some other thought. I read into most of these things. I spent way too long reading and getting trapped down rabbit holes and whatnot. But one thought about why Jews still do this is because milk symbolizes life. It's what like young things use to survive, and that's what builds life. And meat is like, it takes the death of an animal in order for that to happen. And so we don't need to mix life and death. And that's something that at least some of these people will go for as well. Want to at least get to some of these feasts and some of those beliefs and the doctrine. But there are some important feasts. As we know, in the Old Testament, there were like really 3 important feast days. And there are some of these that are still applicable, and some of these are different. But the first one here, they celebrate Rosh Hashanah, which is usually between September to October. And like all these dates of Jewish feast and customs, they do change. They don't exactly line up with the calendar that we use. So that's why it's very mobile. That's why, by the way, Easter, we have, like this year, Easter is April 17th. Some years it's in March, and it's like mid to late March to mid to late April, and that's because of where the Passover is actually. So these dates, they can change, and so you have to keep up with it according to the Jewish calendar as well. But Rosh Hashanah, beginning of the year, so it's a new year, 10-day period of solemn reflection, self-examination, repentance. And then that kind of ends, the high point of this, the 10th day after the new year, with Yom Kippur. And that's the Day of Atonement. And it's a day of fasting. There's like a mandatory fast. And actually, I've talked to some Jews at school, like during that time, and they'll be like, it's really hard because they're fasting that day. And so it is a thing. They approach God, confessions of sins. In the Bible, during this time, they would have a goat who would act as the scapegoat. The priest would lay his hand on it and, like, in a sense, transferring the sins of the people here, and they would send the goat off into the wilderness, and that signified, it's taking their sin and going away. There are some. Not every one of them do it. I think typically some of the Orthodox Jews, and depending on where they are, I don't know 100% about like what the regulations are, what that looks like, because, I mean, you look at the Old Testament and you see the priests are involved. And this is one thing to think about when talking to Jewish people. How do we know who the priests are? Priests are from what tribe? Levi, has to be. Since the temple was destroyed in AD 70, the genealogies have been really kind of muddled and confused. So to be able to know for sure that someone is from the tribe of Levi and able to do that, it's uncertain. So that being said, there are still groups who do that. And depending on who it is, it's what extent that they do it. But there's definitely still some. Actually, I'm going to write that down and look into that a little more, because I meant to do that. That was one of the rabbit holes I meant to go down, but I didn't. So, which types do?
There's a documentary on YouTube regarding one of these holy days where they're making sacrifices. It's pretty graphic, but it's still documented that they still perform these sacrifices
Gotcha.
in mass.
Right.
Large.
Well, that would be interesting to look into. That's your homework.
I bet you could say it's not any of the U.S. Christians.
I would say probably not most, at least. Yeah. I would imagine that that's true. Oh man, not ready for that. There's way too much stuff left. Anyways, Passover, I think you're familiar with that. And that's very important. And when we talk about how to talk to a Jew, that's a good place to go. Hanukkah, Feast of Dedication. Did you know Jesus celebrated Hanukkah? In John 10, verse 22, talks about he went there at the time of the Feast of Dedication, which was the celebration of Judas Maccabeus and the Maccabean revolt, when Antiochus Epiphanes of, I almost said Germany, goodness no, Greece, that Greek leader who came in, offered a sacrifice of pigs on the altar of the temple, which was just terrible, awful, and the Maccabean revolt got them out of there, and there's the whole story about the oil that didn't run out, and God's deliverance there. So there was that. Also, the Feast of Purim celebrates Esther and what she did. Remember when there was a threat to eradicate the Jews in the land of that time, and that whole story. Now, something that I want to mention before we run out of time, and we can get back into some of this, but one thing I want you to think about and look at between now and Wednesday, because this will help us more than anything, I think. Why don't Jews believe in Jesus? Now, we already said some of them do, but a lot of Jews don't, and they do not claim Jesus as the Messiah. They know Jesus was a real person, but they deny his messiahship based on a few things. And there's a lot of reasons that you'll see people give of why Jesus can't be the Messiah. But here's a few things, and I want you to write down some of these so you can, maybe just in the notes section down somewhere. But here's why Jews don't believe in Jesus. One, they're looking for universal peace. They claim that the Messiah will bring universal peace. And that comes from Isaiah 2, verses 1 through 4. They look at that, especially verse 4, the scripture that says, and in this time they will beat their swords into plowshares and that sort of thing. They'll get rid of their weapons, and everybody will have peace. that's something to look into. So that scripture, how do we look at that? Second one, all people will know and honor God. And that comes from Jeremiah 31. Really, verse 34 is the big thing there. The whole section on the new covenant, that's there. And so what they say is, well, there's not peace. We still have wars, and not everybody claims to know God. So how can Jesus have been the Messiah when we still have all this stuff going on? Also, the third one, they say all Jews will come back to Jerusalem. There's a few different prophecies that talk about that. And so that'll be that. And then the fourth one, and this mainly comes from the end of Ezekiel, but rebuilding the temple, restoring David as king. We don't have the temple. We don't have David reigning as king. So that must mean that we don't have the Messiah yet. So those are the things that I want you to look at and think about a little bit. We'll also definitely get into the actual questions that are here. I just thought that this would be helpful to think about. Next to that stuff, you may just want to write down, because I think that this helps think through some of this stuff. Isaiah 2, Daniel 2, Joel 2, and Acts 2. So Isaiah 2, Daniel 2, Joel 2, and Acts 2. I want you to see if you can make some connections between these, because I think there's some helpful things. If you look through some of those prophecies and look and see what happened in Acts, it helps connect some of these things together. I think that would be helpful as well. All people will know God. This is an unofficial list, but it was interesting because I listened to 4 or 5 different videos of people saying why Jesus wasn't the Messiah, and those reasons were common on all. And it was interesting; they used almost the same exact verses too. Isaiah 2, verse 4, Jeremiah 31, 34, and so if that's a common thing that's used among a big group of them, it's good to have an understanding of that. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, not sure. They were just labeled as rabbi. I'm assuming it's more orthodox, but could be some of the others. Anyways, thanks everybody for class. It was good stuff. We'll look forward to Wednesday discussing how to talk to them.